My name is Kanika. I am the host of your webinar. I also happen to be the co-founder and vice president of sales for HyperTest. Um, I'm not sure how familiar you are with us, so it is my responsibility to let you know that we, as a team of excited young engineers, are helping hundreds of teams supercharge their code coverage. We also provide a super cool way to do contract testing. And we are excited to have you in this special masterclass on contract testing. Now, Bas is going to take a lot of time explaining multiple approaches of contract testing, how you should go about it. I have been a part of one of his sessions before. It is awesome. And before you forget me completely, I thought I will tell you that the most unique thing about the way we do things at HyperTest is that all the code that you see Bas show today in the masterclass that he's going to write, you don't have to write any code with HyperTest. So you can generate contract tests without writing a single line of code. And that is what this young team can help you with. Again, not going to bore you with any details. I hope that you join from different parts of the world, and I'm going to skip my polls and probably get to talking about what you all came here for. Before I do that, I do need to tell you that HyperTest is organizing a contract test challenge. The topic being contract testing. We assume that a lot of you here are here to learn about contract testing. In this challenge, you can use HyperTest to generate contract tests, as I said, without writing any line of code, and also take away a $100 voucher. Not going to bore you with any of the details. What is more important is there is a prize for you and you can do something about contract testing. I'll share more details towards the end of the webinar. All right, this is the longest I have waited ever in all my emceeing before I have introduced a guest. So without any further delay, let me introduce my dear friend Bas, who is joining us all the way from the Netherlands. So Bas Dijkstra is an independent test automation consultant. He has been around longer than I even know what is contract testing and test automation, 17, 18 years. Not to give away his or my age, but he is extremely experienced in the space. What I found really incredible and maybe is helpful for all of you who want to write APIs in C#, he's a developer of restassured.net, which is a library that will help you make writing tests in C# a breeze. He is joining us from a very fun place where I would like to be right now, which is Netherlands. Thank you, Bas, for being here. I am also excited about the fact that he and I share the same passion for reading books, because when I am not doing anything, I'm reading a book. So Bas, what book are you reading now? Don't tell me it is contract testing. And welcome.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Kanika. But are you in the I'm only reading business and IT books, or are you I'm in the reading for pleasure and relaxation camp?
So you asking me that question?
Yes, I'm asking you.
Okay. So I've tried my best to give a really short answer. I indulge in stoicism, and I am a very big fan of Ryan Holiday. So I'd like to indulge deeply in a lot of Stoic books. So that's like one reason. So it's indulgence. And then, of course, I read books to become a better version of who I am. So that's the selfish bit. So there's indulgence and then there is selfishness.
Okay, I'm way more selfish than you are. I really only read for entertainment, so a lot of crime stories, detectives, those kinds of things. I love those.
Nice.
I'm currently reading Mystic River. I don't know if that name might ring a bell, because like so many good books, a movie has been made out of it. I've not seen the movie actually, but I've heard good things about it. And then I ran into the book, and now I'm reading the book, and it's very, very good.
Nice. Well,
Yes.
I could have guessed actually that that's the kind of genre that you would read. And
I don't know.
well, yeah, of course. So thanks for sharing that. And you'll also be happy to know that I solved the problem of the polls. So I was able to conduct a poll which you wanted us to, which is how many
Yes.
people are familiar, unfamiliar with contract testing. So let me get you to take a guess. So we had 4 options: new to contract testing, heard of it, but no hands-on, some hands-on, and regularly run contract tests. What do you think a majority of the people here?
I think I'm sorry, and this is sort of kind of a wild guess. I think most people will have chosen this option number 2.
Wow.
It makes sense because if they have never heard of contract testing, they wouldn't be here. Because,
Okay.
and if they knew everything about contract testing, they might think, well, there's not a lot of new information that I'm going to get here. So it's sort of kind of maybe a little bit of an educated guess, but
Okay,
yeah.
yeah, it sounds like a very educated guess. But what surprises me is that there are 17% people here who have hands-on experience. So thank you for joining us, the ones who have experience. And 50% heard about it, have no hands-on experience. You may want to even try the contract testing challenge, attempt to for you to get the $100 voucher. And then there are 33% who are new to this. So
Awesome.
I'm going to end my poll, and I promise to sit as quietly and patiently as possible and hand it over to you. The poll shows an error when the first time submitting. Okay, I think we got someone to. Thank you for sharing that. We will complain to Zoom about ruining my webinar with these polls, but I will hand it over to Bas to start the masterclass.
Awesome. There we go. Can you just very quickly confirm once again? And we tested all of this because that's what we do, but that you can see my screen.
Yes.
Zoom tells me participants can now see your screen, but I much prefer hearing that from an actual person than from some piece of software. Thank you. Well, I'm not going to talk any longer about myself because Kanika already did a wonderful job of that. Let me talk to you about contract testing and contract testing as an approach to solve the integration testing puzzle. Before we dive into the code and the tools and everything, I'd like to take a couple of minutes to illustrate the problem space, really. What problem? Because we all love tools, we all love diving into new tools. At some point, it's probably a good idea to step back and think, what's the problem that we're actually trying to solve here? So let me start with that. Lots of software systems and applications these days are to some extent distributed. People love to talk about microservices. To be honest, I don't even know what that means anymore. But the reality is that lots of software systems are distributed. So they have they are built out of different components, different layers, different systems, different services that communicate with one another and that exchange data and that rely on one another. And that's all lovely because you can do development distributed over different teams, different companies, even. So that's all well and good. But it does pose some additional challenges when it comes to testing these things. Um, in particular, it makes it harder to get an answer in an efficient way to this question. All of those individual components and services, are they able to communicate with one another? Are there any known integration issues. So in about 10 minutes or so, I'm going to move to a live demo so you can see how that actually works in practice. We've got one provider service there that deals with data around addresses. I'm just going to assume that the team that's responsible for developing and running and maintaining that service does their testing. So they test against the behavior of the address provider service, and they do that from their own perspective with their own interpretation of, oh, this is how we think our service should work. I hope they do that. That's all well and good. That's not what contract testing is. This is just plain what people call functional testing, acceptance testing, whatever kind of testing. They test your own software. With distributed software systems, the biggest challenge is you are not your own consumer. This address provider service will typically be consumed by other systems, by other services. And each of those consumers will have their own expectations about the behavior of the address provider. In this case, for this example, we have another service that deals with data around orders. And orders have a delivery address, and customers, they have a billing address maybe. So there's also a service that deals with customer data. And both of these consumer services rely on our address service as a provider. And there might be a mismatch between how the address provider service actually behaves and how these consumers expect it to behave. And again, please keep in mind, consumers and providers might be developed in different teams by different people. Maybe the consumers expect a delivery, a type field, an address type field with a string value to be in the response, but it's not there. Maybe it is there, but they expect it to be formatted a little bit differently. Dates and times, always fun. Maybe these consumers expect a date and time to be formatted like this, but it's actually returned something like this. And there might also be differences in mismatches in the expectations between individual consumers. Maybe consumer A, the order consumer, expects a date to be formatted like this, whereas the customer consumer expects something different, formatted in a different way. And the address provider will typically only return dates and times in one single format. This is what we try, and these are the kinds of mismatches between expectations and actual behavior that we try and uncover during integration and end-to-end testing. The traditional way in which teams and organizations have been trying to do that is by trying to integrate and test everything at once. So if we have services A, B, C, and D, we're going to deploy them in some kind of shared testing environment or staging environment or whatever you call it, configure them, provide them with the right data, and try and do our integration tests. A couple of problems there. First of all, as soon as where the number of services and components grows, this gets harder to manage. And because all of these components might be developed and deployed by different teams, maybe even different organizations, coordination is a horror show. I've seen organizations that have teams of people whose only responsibility it is to organize these things. And that doesn't sound like a fun job to me. And also, if you get this right, and if you are able to do this, you can only do this very late in the process, if you even get to do it at all. That's where contract testing comes in. And contract testing is again, it's trying to get to address the same question. Are all these individual components and services able to communicate with one another? But they do that in, it differs from the traditional approach of integration testing in two ways. First of all, instead of focusing on everything at once, it focuses on the integration of individual consumers and providers. So that's breaking down the puzzle, so to say. Instead of deploying everything in a single environment, it focuses on individual integrations. The other, and arguably even more important difference, is that traditional integration end-to-end testing is synchronous, meaning if I want to test the integration between A and B, I need to deploy A and B in some kind of shared testing environment, set them up and have them talk to one another, have them actually live exchange of requests and responses of data. Contract-based integration end-to-end testing is asynchronous, meaning that both the consumer and the provider still have a role to play, but they have their own responsibilities in the process, but they can do that as part of their own local development and deployment and build cycle. Because all the information that's required is shared, written down, is shared by means of contracts, meaning that if I want to test the integration between A and B, consumer A, provider B, using contracts, A and B do not have to be in some kind of shared testing environment anymore. All we need to know about what A wants and what B provides is written down in contracts. To put a marketing term on it, contract testing shifts left your integration testing efforts. A slightly less marketing-y way of saying this is that contract-based testing allows us to do integration testing earlier in the process.
Hey, Bas.
Yes.
So I promised I would stay quiet, but I didn't mean it.
No, please do.
So what confuses me the moment you put the word shift left is it feels like devs do it. Who does contract testing?
We'll get to that.
Okay.
Is that okay? Do you accept that as an answer for now?
I will try. Yes.
It is a very good, a very relevant question. And it is actually one of the challenges in implementing certain types of contract testing.
All right.
But very good question. Thank you. So there are a couple of different approaches to contract testing. Three, actually. We have consumer-driven, provider-driven, and bidirectional contract testing. Most people immediately think of consumer-driven contract testing when they talk about contract testing. Why? Because PACT is so popular. PACT is a consumer-driven contract testing tool. We'll have a look at PACT in a moment, but it's only one of three different approaches to contract testing. With consumer-driven contract testing, it's the consumer who generates the contract, publishes that to some kind of central contract repository. The provider pulls in, downloads contracts from and a contract contains expectations about the behavior of a provider from a single consumer. So in this case, if we have two consumers that rely on the same provider, this is two contracts. One between the customer consumer and the order provider, one between the order consumer and the address provider. So the provider downloads the contracts, verifies that it can meet all of the expectations, so written down in the contracts, publish the verification results back to the contract repository, and then both the consumer and the provider can have a look at the contract repository to check if there are any known integration issues before they deploy a certain version of their service into an environment that just might be your production environment. Provider-driven contract testing is basically just the provider telling the consumer what it does. There's no feedback loop, no conversation, nothing. So that's much simpler, but not very flexible and not very powerful. And then a third approach is bidirectional contract testing, where both the consumer and the provider publish their own version of a contract. And verification is done by the contract repository. So and that contract repository matches the expectations from the consumer contract and the actual behavior written down in a provider contract, checks if there are any potential mismatches, conflicts of interest, or whatever you want to call them. And then both the consumer and the provider can have a look at the results of that verification and see, is it safe to deploy? And this is actually where I see a lot of people and teams go. This step is skipped by a lot of teams and organizations. The question of, well, what type of contract testing is the best fit for my specific situation? Let's have a look at consumer-driven contract testing, or CDCT. So again, it's the consumers who formalize or write down expectations about provider behavior in contracts, and then the providers can use tools to automatically verify that they meet the expectations. The good thing for providers is they can pretty much do whatever they want. They can develop, refactor, completely rewrite their code base without fear, because they know what their consumers expect of them. And for the consumers, it's a great way to build trust in the providers to do what's expected of them and to keep doing that. Tools. I didn't mention HyperTest in here, Kanika. Maybe I should. I should definitely check it out, and maybe it'll make an appearance in the next time I do this talk. But there are two CDCT tools that I know of. One of them is Pact. I mentioned that one already. That's also the tool that we're going to take a look at in the demo. The nice thing about Pact is that it's available for a wide range of programming languages. The other one I know of is Spring Cloud Contract, which is probably a fantastic tool. I've not used it, but one limitation or downside is that it's Java only, and more specifically, it's very closely tied to the Spring Boot, so to the Spring ecosystem, hence the name. So if all of your services are Spring services, Spring Cloud Contract is probably a very good choice. If you have a more heterogeneous environment or technology stack, Pact is probably your go-to choice. And again, for this demo, I'm using Pact. So the way Pact works is I've got a consumer, generates a contract. From that contract, the Pact consumer library also generates a mock provider that behaves exactly as the consumer expects the provider to behave, and the consumer can use that to test its own implementation. But that contract, more importantly, of course, is passed on to the provider, and Pact on the provider side from that contract generates a mock client and replays all the interactions written down in the contract against an actual running instance of the provider, and that produces verification results, which are then published, and the outcome of that verification can be used by the consumer and the provider to see if it's safe to deploy. To do efficient distribution and management of versions of contracts and versions of contracts and the corresponding verification results, we need that contract repository. And with Pact, that's the Pact broker. Because a manual distribution of contracts is not very efficient. And the Pact broker provides automatic distribution versioning of contracts and the corresponding verification results. There are two flavors, actually. So there's an open source self-hosted Pact broker, which is available as a Docker container. And there's Pact Flow. Pact Flow is one of the two flavors. Pact Flow is a commercially licensed tool with a free plan, but that free plan is fairly limited. What you'll see in the demo is me using packed flow, not because I get paid by SmartBear to show it, but because it's available in the cloud, as people say, as a SaaS solution, which makes the setup just a lot easier. But everything related to consumer-driven contract testing, what I'm showing you with packed flow can be done with the open source packed broker as well. That's good to keep in mind. We'll get to some differences, hopefully, somewhere a little bit later in the demo. So the way this works is we have a consumer and a provider. We have the broker. The consumer generates and publishes a contract. The provider downloads it, verifies its own behavior against the expectations, publishes the verification results, and then a tool called Can I Deploy, which is part of the packed ecosystem, can be used in both the consumer and the provider deployment pipeline to check, is it safe to deploy? Are there any known integration issues? Let's have a look at how that works in practice. So what I've created here is a small code base, which I use for all these kinds of demos and talks and workshops that I run, with 2 consumers and 1 provider. Let's have a look at my customer consumer tests. Here we go. Again, this is packed in Java. Packed is available for a wide range of programming languages. The syntax is a little bit different, of course, from one programming language to the next. The concepts are the same. It's also good to know that if I have a contract that's generated by packed in Java for the consumer, that can be verified by packed in C# or Go or PHP or JavaScript or whatever, if my provider is written in that language, because the contracts are standardized. They are JSON files, which can be generated and verified by all the packed bindings. So for example, what happens? Sorry, my throat is playing up a little bit. So what happens in, let's consider the situation where I retrieve address data from my address provider. And the situation is that, well, I use the address ID to retrieve the data, and the data exists. Meaning I expect data to be returned by the address provider. This snippet tells me, allows me to express what expectations I have as a consumer of the way that data that's returned from the provider looks like. So for example, I expect an address type to be there, an address type field to be there, and I expect the value to be a string. I expect a zip code, and that should be an integer. I expect an ID field, and that should be a UUID. And by UUID, I mean it's a string, but not just any string. It's a string that matches a specific regular expression. I'm also telling here that that address should exist. This is the consumer telling the provider what state it needs to be in before verifying this interaction. And it tells me if I do a get and use a valid existing address ID, I expect you to respond with an HTTP 200 and a body that looks like this. Apologies. And then I have other expectations for different situations. So how should the provider respond if the address ID does not exist? Then the only expectation I've got is that it should be responded, the response should be a 404. And if the address ID is incorrectly formatted, it should be an HTTP format. These are the corresponding tests, which write these expectations to the contract, and B, test the implementation of the consumer in these specific situations. So if I run my tests, two things will happen. My customer consumer implementation will be tested, but also the contract will be generated. I did this for the order provider already, and I published the contract already, just to save you a little bit of time, because unfortunately, Zoom has the habit of slowing my machine down, which means that it takes a little bit longer for the tests to run and everything.
Bas, if you wanted to go and get some water, I can run another poll with
I'm fine. I've got water.
right.
So,
All
but
right.
thank you very much, Kanika.
No problem.
It's just that it's not going to get any better, but I'll power through it. No worries. But thank you. So my tests have run now, which means that, and this is all commands and that are made possible by plugins that are available within the Pact ecosystem. This publishes the contract that was just generated, and that ends up in my target folder here. So that's this JSON file containing all of the interactions with the expectations. This one is the most interesting one. I typically don't look into detail at the contract very much, because it's all generated by this is all automatically generated by the code. When I publish this to my broker, it'll end up in a moment. So this is my broker here. This is Pact Flow. So the contract generated by the order consumer is already there. And if I do a refresh, it should now also have a contract for the customer consumer, because that's what I published a few seconds ago. So this tells me consumer version 100 published a new contract, as did the order consumer actually a couple of minutes ago. It's not yet verified by the address provider. And here I can see some more details about what's exactly in that contract. So this is all generated from that JSON file that we saw just now. So we have these 5 interactions here once again. So there's 3 that I showed you related to HTTP GET, to retrieving data. And I added 2 other ones in a different test class for expected behavior around deleting addresses. So now it's the address provider turn. So the consumers have done their job now. They generated and published the contracts with their expectations about the behavior of the address provider. And the provider, so let me quickly switch this because I want to use the broker and not the local folder. I can use this code on the provider side to pull in all the contracts, replay all the interactions against a running instance of my provider service, and publish the contracts back to the, let's see if I have that command somewhere, because it's pretty long. No, I don't, which means I have to type it out. Maven clean. So I need to pass a couple of flags here, which is Pact verifier. I need to tell it that I actually want to publish the results. And I need to tell it my provider version. That's also 100. Here we go. Is that correct? That looks good. So running the tests on the provider side pulls in the contracts from the broker, replays all the interactions that the consumers wrote down against the current implementation of the provider, checks that the response that's actually returned by the provider match the expectations, and publishes the verification results back to my broker. So that takes a while because it needs to spin up my actual provider instance. But hopefully what you've seen so far is, so in this demo project, my consumers and my provider are in the same repository. That's not a very typical situation. But the tests that I've been doing, both on the consumer side and on the provider side, don't require, they can be done as part of a local development and build cycle. So there's no actual interactions between a consumer and a provider. It's all been done by means of a contract. So if I refresh this, I can see both for the order consumer and the end for the customer consumer, everything is fine. So there are no known integration issues. Kanika, how long do I have left?
You have around 10, 15 minutes.
10, 15 minutes.
I was so deeply engrossed in what you were saying. I'm pretty sure everyone else is. And I've not seen anyone leave. So you have comfortably 15 to 20.
Awesome. Let's show quickly, very quickly then what happens if something goes wrong. Close this one. Let's change just very quickly, change an expectation. This one. Let's say for a new version, I've got a new version of my customer consumer, and that suddenly expects a successful delete to be responded to with an HTTP 200 instead of a 204. Why? I don't know. I just want to very quickly trigger a mismatch between consumer expectations and provider implementation, actual behavior. So let me quickly update this to version 101 so that it becomes very clear. Go back to the customer consumer. Run the tests again. I need to run the tests again on the customer because this generates my new contract. I could have just updated the JSON directly, but please never do that. Your contract is generated by your tests, by your code. So please don't manually modify it. Modify the code that generates the contract instead. So that's what I've done. But the downside here is that I need to run the tests again. Then I can, no, not PVN, Maven, Pact, publish the new contract associated with customer consumer version 101. As we can see. So this publishes a new contract to the provider, to the Pact broker. So if I do a refresh, there's no change for the order consumer. That's still all okay. Nothing's changed there for that specific integration. But for the customer consumer, it now has a new contract that's not yet verified. If I look at the matrix, I can see exactly, and because my broker versions the contracts and the corresponding verification results. So I can still see that consumer version 100 and provider version 100 are compatible, no known integration issues. If I go to the address provider again, of course, I'm not going to type that one again. So nothing changed on the provider side, but it needs to, there's a new contract for the provider to verify. One way, by the way, to automatically trigger this is to create a webhook from within your provider that automatically triggers a provider build whenever a consumer publishes a new contract. And I know there's all kinds of ifs and buts that are connected to that, but technically it's definitely an option. It is one of the reasons that provider teams are typically a bit hesitant to adopt this, because they say, well, oh, but now an action on our consumer side is going to trigger a build for us at the provider side. So implementation of this has a couple of challenges. Kanika, you asked about another one just now. I don't know if you were aware of that, but it is one of the challenges. Who's going to do all of this work? We'll get to that in a moment. Let's see. Oh, yes, failures. Yay. Again, keep in mind what I've done is I've published a new contract, a new consumer contract, with an expectation, with expected behavior that my provider does not match, because the provider, for a successful delete, it returns a 204 and not a 200. So if I do a refresh again, I can see all of this information in Packflow 2, because now the contract published by consumer version 101 cannot be completely matched, not completely successfully verified by provider version 100. And I can even take a look at, well, what interactions are still okay and which ones give a problem. And that's this one. So for this integration, this consumer, in this situation, for this interaction, expected a status code of 200, but what the provider actually returned was 204. And so this gives us the information about which consumer and provider versions are compatible and which ones have potential integration issues. Pack does not point fingers, and Packflow does not point fingers at, oh, the consumer should fix things or the provider should fix things. The only responsibility, and I think that's correct, is it gives you insights into potential integration issues in a mismatch between expectations on the one end from the consumer and actual behavior from the provider on the other side. And then it's up to the development teams, the respective development teams, to figure out how they are going to address this. And the answer will always be, it depends there. So some useful resources. I don't know if there's a way to distribute the slides to participants so that you can publish them, Kanika, in some way.
Yeah.
Awesome. So they don't need to remember the links to these YouTube videos, which is a good thing.
Yes.
So there are some challenges here when adopting consumer-driven contract testing. One of them is that it's typically it's not always easy to get provider teams on board, especially because now they already need to do the development and their own testing, and now suddenly they also need to take into account what the consumers want from them. And if the consumer makes a mistake in writing and generating the contract, that could break a provider build, which is hard. Same thing for the webhooks. It speeds up the process, but provider teams aren't always very willing to just adopt and accept that. So, and another challenge is, and that now I'm coming back, it took me a while, Kanika, to your question about who's going to do this work because of the shift left. Another challenge is, so we're solving a testing problem here, but it's development work. And especially, it's code. If you look closely at the code, you'll see that the test code calls the application code. So it's really breaking down the integration testing issue and bringing it back to the unit testing level. And there's still, unfortunately, I must say, quite a big group of testers who say, ooh, unit tests, that's what a developer does. I don't want to have anything to do with this. So that's another challenge. How to get testers involved in this? I think they should, because again, we're solving a testing problem here. But it's a lot of development work to get this implemented. And the fine people at Pact, they also saw some of these things, and there are some situations where Pact is very useful, like consumer-driven contract testing is very useful, but there's also situations where it's maybe not the best choice. One attempt and one way to address quite a few of these challenges is bidirectional contracts. Big disclaimer, this is Pact flow only, which means that what I'm going to show you next, if Kanika is kind enough to give me 6-7 more minutes. I'm sorry?
I have 6.
I have 6. Awesome.
Minutes.
I'll just talk very fast then. It's bidirectional. It's a different approach. So instead of so this is the consumer-driven contract testing flow, where the consumer publishes a contract, which is verified by the provider, and so on. Both the consumer and the provider generate and publish their own contract, which is checked for compatibility by the broker. And this logic, this feature, is only available in Pact flow, not in the open source Docker-based Pact broker. Just so you know. Let's have a look at an example. So this works very well, for example, when, let's just reset this stuff and then say, this, for example, works very well if you deal with public APIs. With public APIs, consumer-driven contract testing is never going to work, because that public API probably has hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of consumers. And they're not going to listen to these individual consumers with all their wishes and expectations. So, yes, thank you. I didn't want to move anyway. So let's say this order consumer, it's a web shop. They probably also want their orders to be paid for. They now also have an integration. No, I don't want to refactor. Other tests that test against a mock version of a payment provider. Again, payment provider, public API, not going to do consumer-driven contract testing. The nice thing is I don't need Pact to do this. I could write my... So both the consumer and the provider publish their own version of a contract. The consumer could use Pact to do that, but there's other options as well. For example, the YMOC Pact generator. So this YMOC Pact generator is a library that generates a Pact-compatible contract based on traffic to and from a YMOC instance. So if I go to my order consumer and run my tests, this is going to generate a consumer-driven contract using Pact for the integration with the address provider. And it's going to generate another contract based on the YMOC traffic for the integration between the order consumer and the payment provider. Again, no need to use Pact, and these kinds of tests using YMOC and using other kinds of API clients is typically a lot closer to what testers and automation engineers do. So this is a more comfortable kind of testing for them. So it's running the tests again. This will generate 2 contracts. One for these 2. No, I don't want to refactor. I don't know why it keeps insisting that I do. If I publish this, so this is this one in particular, this is my contract that's generated by the YMOC pact generator and publishes this to my pact broker. And so this is the consumer contract, and the provider contract. Right now, PactFlow really only supports one format, which is an open API specification. So that's in here, actually, and this put command publishes that provider side contract, that open API specification, to PactFlow, to my pact broker. And then it's the broker that compares the expectations in the consumer contract with the actual behavior as specified in the open API. So this is the provider contract. So if I go here, it tells me this was all good. So this is here, both the consumer and the provider published their own contract, and my broker, i.e. PactFlow, did the comparison. So it's told, and in this case, it's compatible. This is what my consumer contract looked like. This is, again, all generated from YAML, not using Pact. And the provider contract is an open API specification. So this is a more lightweight, easier to implement approach to contract testing, which can use Pact, but doesn't have to, but definitely has to use PactFlow. There are some links in there in the slides if you want to have. I know I went over this fairly quickly. There's some more information here in the links. Want to learn more? There's a contract testing course at Test Automation University. I'm quite excited to learn that HyperTest has contract testing capabilities. I've not had the chance to test that out yet. I'll definitely will. And a book is coming. I'm not going to write it, but I know people are very hard at work at writing a contract testing book, and I, for one, am very excited, very much looking forward to reading that. So I'm actually going to read some IT and business and work related books
And not just relax.
at some point, and not just relax. Awesome. That's it for me, Kanika.
Thank you. That was really exciting. And thank you, everyone, for staying back. Only if you can give me few more minutes to wrap up, thank Bas, and give you away a few things for staying with us. Please hold on for another 5 minutes. So firstly, Bas, so that I have HyperTest next time on your slides, I just would like to add that, HyperTest automatically actually generates the mock for the provider when testing for the consumer, and at the same time, marks the consumer when testing for the provider. So hopefully that little bit of insight gets you more curious to have us there. And if not, no problems at all, because the only goal of us running these webinars is to share awareness and knowledge. And the reason why I asked that question about who should do this is we would want more people to adopt contract testing. So thank you so much for being an amazing speaker. I say this not just on behalf of everyone here, but like the whole team of HyperTest, which was buzzing on our WhatsApp channel while you were talking. So thank you so much. We are giving away a state of API testing report for all the data that we have collected on API testing on our platform in 2023. So that is going to come your way for everyone that has joined the webinar. One last bit, I'm on our website. We are running a challenge, giving away a prize. And it also gives you a first-hand experience of what contract testing looks like. Again, some more details about us, thanks to our lovely marketing team. Again, I'm again very thankful to you, Bas, for joining us. We've run out of time for questions. I kept requesting everyone to post some questions. So those who have stayed back, please feel free to ask questions. I'm sure Bas would stay here along with me and answer anything that you have. So open to questions.
Absolutely.
All right.
So there are some in the Q&A I can see.
Yeah,
So
I
maybe
can't
it's
see. I can't see the ones in the Q&A. That could just be my screen probably. Okay, I see them now. All right.
awesome.
How to ensure all my teams with different microservices collaborate on Pact? Is there some sort of mechanism that can send alerts to other teams who own different microservices on the updated contracts that may affect their upstream?
That's a very good question. And it is getting people on board is hard. There are some tools that can help you. So one of the things is that you can do a lot of interesting and good and efficient thing with these webhooks. So for example, again, as a consumer, you can immediately trigger a new build on the provider side, and that should then pull in your new and updated consumer contract. So that's one way to do it, to make sure that you don't end up with unverified contracts. In fact, of actual adoption and people wanting to do this in the first place, it still takes talking to people and demonstrating them, and not just showing them the tool, but showing them what you get and what it enables and why you do this. And because you want to identify and address these integration testing these integration issues in a more efficient way earlier in the process. And that I think is the real power behind contract testing. But it will take some convincing of people. If you don't have any integration testing pains, which is very hard to imagine if you have a reasonably distributed software system. But if you don't have that, you don't need contract testing because you don't have any if there's no problem, you don't need a tool to solve it. You don't need a solution. And we're not in the business, although sometimes I feel otherwise, we're not in the business of finding problems for our solutions. We're in the business of finding solutions for our problems. So
Yeah.
how to ensure that all my teams collaborate on it? Show them the value. Show them, and it's probably easy to start within. So if your team is responsible for multiple services, both consumer and providers, to just start there, and because that's an easy sell because it's all in your own team. But at some point, you need to start spreading the message and getting other teams on board, and that sometimes takes a bit of time and talking.
Yeah, and Bas, working with tons of teams who are doing this and seeing the same struggle, we do offer some insight from what other teams have done. So happy to offer that to the group. But let's take the other question while I'm seeing if anyone is interested in hearing more on strategies. Thanks, Bas, for insight on contract testing. She doesn't say this, but I must tell you that your lovely baritone voice makes you a good FBI agent. So that could really be the next thing you could do. Rashmi didn't say it, I'm saying it. Can you please suggest if any open source where POCs can be done on contract testing and some video series for practice for new babies?
For newbies, not new babies again.
Newbies, sorry.
So there's a course on contract testing on Test Automation University. All the code that I used in here is part of its workshop material, and that's available on GitHub. So all of the code that you've seen just now, you can find that on GitHub. I am reasonably sure that the link to the repository is in the slides. If not, You can always ask me for it. Send me an email, send me a LinkedIn message, and I'm more than happy to share the slides and the repository link if you didn't get it.
Yeah, we'll send the slides along with the report to everyone who has joined.
And there's
sorry.
So there's links to videos on there as well. Yep.
All right. I'll let you finish. Sorry about that. Is bidirectional contract testing similar to schema validation?
No. To some extent, yes, but it also does a little more because the consumer contract does not say, well, the expectations from the consumers, and this answer applies to consumer-driven contract testing just as much, by the way. But your consumer contract contains information about how your consumer actually consumes the provider service, and not just about do things match the schema. So, in my opinion, and especially from the provider side, yes, because it's just an open API spec which contains the schemas. But from the consumer side, it's a richer information. It's about how my consumer actually consumes my service, what it does, what that looks like, what it expects. And also that it evolves over time. So your service might not evolve and the schema might not evolve, but maybe the way your consumers actually interact with the service and what they expect from the service evolves. And you capture that in the contracts. And that's information that you wouldn't capture just in schemas.
Thank you. And there's a question that actually touches a sentiment that I've always seen, so I'll pick it up before others. How difficult it is to move from end-to-end testing and integration testing to contract testing if you have no experience of doing contract testing before? Thank you. Very good question.
It's a very good question, Igor. It is difficult. It will take time. And the technical issues probably aren't the biggest problem because you can implement contract testing and it works, and the tooling and the libraries are fairly sophisticated. What's going to take more time and more talking, again, because people, is starting to rely and be confident that your contract-based tests capture, detect potential integration issues that would otherwise be captured by your end-to-end tests. So, and that will take time. That's the hard part. Actually having and getting the confidence to turn off some of those end-to-end tests. You'll still need some end-to-end tests, probably, because you still want to interact with your system as a whole from the perspective of an end user. You'll still need those. But the idea is one of the ideas behind contract testing is to rely to need far less of them. To remove the over-reliance on these slow and expensive end-to-end tests that you can really only do very late in the process, if at all.
Yeah, you know, the last bit could trigger such a debate, but we will move on to the next question. I know a webinar is successful when someone joining it posts a question at 8:35. Mohammed, thank you so much. So I'll take that question. What strategies and tools are most effective for ensuring comprehensive contract testing coverage in complex distributed systems, especially if you're dealing with microservices architecture? If this is a long answer, you can point him to a link or you can answer him briefly.
Strategies and tools are most effective in talking to people. So the contract testing, that's the tool. That's the technique. And ensuring comprehensive contract testing so the challenge is almost often is to not let the consumers ask for too much, to slow the consumers down. Because if they ask for lots of different things with lots of details, there's a bigger risk of conflicts of interest because there's another consumer that might need. So, what strategies and tools? Oh, there's so much to unpack in that question.
Yeah, that's why I said I
really.
think you should well.
I don't even know if I have a link for it, but I know I don't. There is a lot to unpack there.
Yeah. Okay. So I promise, Mohammed, if you drop your email address in chat, we will get back to you through Bas with whatever information we can, because that's the reason why we host.
It is. Again, the last thing I want to do is dismiss the question because it's great, but there's so much to unpack and so much. I need some more information there, and so. But I'm more than happy to have that conversation. Absolutely.
Great. So I've made a note to myself so that I don't forget to get you an answer, so you can hold me accountable. All right, we've got a few more questions that I missed. I apologize for the people. Should I start first with unit tests before I work on contract tests? Is there an order? Is there a pyramid?
I'm going to act as if I didn't hear you say the word pyramid. No, the short answer is yes. It is one of the challenges for some teams, unfortunately, still, because contract testing requires you to do tests. And unfortunately, for some people, that's still, oh, crap, now I need to write tests. But yes, you should always start with unit tests. Contract tests, in the way that I've demonstrated, they are a form of unit tests. So they could go hand in hand, but I'm just going to assume that you had those unit tests all the time, all along. And if you don't, this is a great way to make sure that your team is starting to write unit tests, because you'll have to.
All right, last question, and then we will let all the lovely people go who are waiting for Kanika to wrap up this webinar. Could you please, did I already ask this question? Could you please advise on the importance of having comprehensive API documentation when it comes to developing?
You didn't.
All right, good. So I'm not that bad.
So having good API documentation is great. Absolutely. It helps, definitely. If you have good API documentation, if you, as a provider, if I'm developing an API, it definitely helps to reduce the chances of consumers asking for things they shouldn't ask for. And then as a consequence, breaking the build on the provider side because they asked for something that the provider was never going to deliver on, never going to provide anyway. And good documentation helps avoid a lot of those situations in the first place. If you document your API well, you say, well, this is what I expect. And these are the fields, these are mandatory, these ones are optional, these are the data types, this is what that operation does. It helps a lot in so yes, it's important. Can you do without? Of course. Will it help you avoid confusion and potential annoyance from consumers expecting things that the provider was never going to provide in the first place? Absolutely. So documentation helps. Yes.
All right. On that note, thank you everyone who stayed back till the end. As I promised, you will get a state of API testing report along with the presentation that Bas did today. Bas, thank you so much on behalf of everyone. Have a great evening wherever you are. Have fun. Thank you for joining.
Thank
That's
you,
that.
everybody. And thank you, Kanika, for having me. I really, really enjoyed it.
Thank you. It was lovely having you.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.